Picture a moment when the destiny of Western civilization balanced on Mediterranean waves. Envision the mightiest empire of its age dispatching an unstoppable armada to eliminate Christian opposition permanently. This chronicle recounts the Battle of Lepanto, fought on October 7, 1571, and reveals the groundbreaking weapon that determined the fate of millions across Europe and beyond. For those captivated by tales of military brilliance, technological breakthroughs, and pivotal historical moments, this narrative delivers all three in spectacular fashion. To comprehend the significance of this confrontation in the Gulf of Patras, we must journey back several decades to understand a world teetering on transformation. The 16th century witnessed extraordinary upheaval as empires collided in conflicts that redrew maps and reshaped civilizations. The Ottoman Empire, under Sultan Selim II's rule, had evolved into the most formidable military force the world had encountered. Their conquest of Constantinople in 1453 had extinguished a millennium of Byzantine civilization, opening floodgates to unprecedented territorial expansion. From that transformative moment, Ottoman ambitions knew no boundaries. Their armies swept through Eastern Europe, subjugated Hungary, laid siege to Vienna's walls, dominated North African territories, and effectively transformed the Mediterranean Sea into what contemporaries termed a Turkish domain. The Ottoman naval forces embodied maritime supremacy in its purest form. Their combat vessels, long, sleek galleys, driven predominantly by synchronized oars, cut through waters with remarkable velocity. Each warship carried hundreds of oarsmen, many being Christian captives from previous campaigns, condemned to grueling servitude in the vessel's lower decks. Above them, elite warriors known as Janissaries prepared for the brutal hand-to-hand fighting that inevitably followed every naval collision. The Ottoman battle approach was straightforward yet devastatingly efficient. Their galleys accelerated toward adversaries using the coordinated power of hundreds of synchronized oars. Upon impact, a bronze ram mounted on the ship's prow punctured enemy hulls, while grappling hooks locked vessels together. Then commenced the true carnage. Janissaries, wielding scimitars, bows, and arquebuses, swarmed enemy decks in relentless waves. This warfare methodology had been perfected across generations, and few military forces worldwide could withstand such ferocious assaults. Ottoman dominance extended beyond mere military prowess. They possessed an extraordinarily efficient administrative apparatus capable of mobilizing resources from 3 continents. Their shipyards in Istanbul could construct a complete galley within days. Trade networks connecting Asia to Europe generated immense wealth financing ever more ambitious expansions. Sultan Selim II, though lacking his father Suleiman, the magnificent's military genius, inherited a perfectly calibrated war machine hungry for further conquests. Meanwhile, Christian Europe faced a desperate predicament. The nations that should have unified against a common menace remained deeply fragmented. The Protestant Reformation had splintered Christendom, creating rivalries that sometimes appeared more intense than the Islamic conflict itself. France, despite being Catholic, maintained pragmatic alliances with the Ottomans to weaken Habsburg rivals. England focused on internal matters and growing Spanish threats rather than distant Mediterranean events. Only a handful of powers remained vigilant against Ottoman advances. Philip II of Spain, ruling an empire where the sun never set, understood Mediterranean control hung in the balance. The Republic of Venice, the Adriatic's commercial jewel, watched trade routes strangled one by one. The Papal States under Pope Pius V recognized that Rome itself faced potential threats if Ottomans remained unchecked. The final confrontation's trigger came with the Ottoman conquest of Cyprus. This island, a Venetian stronghold for nearly a century, fell after a brutal siege exceeding 1 year. Venetian resistance proved heroic yet futile. When the capital Famagusta finally surrendered in August 1571, the Venetian commander, Marcantonio Bragadin, was promised safe passage. Instead, he endured unimaginable torture and was ultimately flayed alive, his skin stuffed with straw and displayed as a trophy in Istanbul. This atrocity shocked all of Europe and ultimately provided the catalyst for a Christian alliance. Pope Pius V, a man of iron determination and shrewd political vision, labored tirelessly to forge a seemingly impossible coalition. He needed to unite Venice, which had lost Cyprus and demanded vengeance, with Spain, which viewed Venetians as inconvenient commercial competitors. Through skillful diplomacy, passionate religious appeals, and promises of material benefits, the Pope achieved what many deemed impossible. In May 1571, the Holy League was born. A coalition of Christian states committed to halting Ottoman expansion. To command this Christian armada, a young man was selected who was already surrounded by legendary aura. Don Juan of Austria was merely 24 years old, yet his name was spoken with reverence throughout Europe. The illegitimate son of Emperor Charles V and half-brother of King Philip II of Spain, Don Juan had proven his military worth by suppressing the Moorish rebellion in Granada. He was charismatic, handsome, cultured, and ambitious. Some whispered he dreamed of conquering Constantinople and restoring the ancient Byzantine Empire under his own rule. But what none questioned was his bravery and absolute determination. The Holy League fleet began assembling in Messina, Sicily. During summer 1571, among the ships arriving from across the western Mediterranean was something unprecedented, something veteran commanders viewed with profound skepticism. These were the Galleasses, vessels representing a radical evolution in naval design. While traditional galleys were low, narrow, and relied primarily on speed and maneuverability, galleasses were true sea monsters. They were larger, taller, with imposing 4.5 deck castles, and carried artillery quantities impossible on regular galleys. The Venetians, always the Mediterranean's most daring naval innovators, had developed this concept through decades of experimentation. A typical galleass measured over 40 meters in length and displaced several hundred tons. Its hull was reinforced to withstand the weight and recoil of dozens of cannons. At the bow, it mounted heavy artillery pieces capable of firing projectiles, weighing 20 kilograms or more at considerable distances. Alongside, rows of smaller cannons created a devastating field of fire, but the true revolution lay not merely in gun numbers, but in the combat philosophy they represented. For centuries, Mediterranean naval warfare had essentially been infantry battle waged on floating platforms. The objective was to close distance, board, and engage in close combat. Artillery existed but was seen primarily as boarding support, not as the decisive weapon itself. Galleasses proposed something radically different, destroying enemies from a distance, before they could even approach boarding range. This idea met considerable resistance. Veteran commanders who had spent decades perfecting galley warfare art viewed galleasses as clumsy aberrations. They were slow, difficult to maneuver, and dependent on wind for effective movement in battles decided by speed and agility. Don Juan of Austria, however, saw something different. He recognized that while galleasses couldn't pursue enemies, they could form anchor points in battle lines, creating impossible kill zones for any galley attempting to advance. He decided to incorporate 6 Venetian galleasses into his battle formation, a decision that would prove absolutely crucial. On the opposite side of the Mediterranean, another impressive force was mobilizing. Muhsinzad Ali Pasha, the Ottoman fleet's supreme admiral, had received direct orders from the Sultan: destroy the Christian fleet once and for all, and pave the way for southern Italy's invasion. Ali Pasha was an experienced, respected commander who commanded a fleet of nearly 300 galleys, each manned by veteran fighters and slaves conditioned to the brutal rhythm of oars. Ottoman confidence bordered on arrogance. They had defeated Christian fleets repeatedly over previous decades. Their most recent Cyprus victory had been complete and crushing. Some Ottoman commanders openly discussed post-victory plans, which Italian cities to sack first. How much territory could be incorporated into the empire? In September 1571, the Holy League fleet finally sailed from Messina. It was a spectacular sight. More than 200 galleys and galleons sailing in formation, their colorful sails creating a multicolored carpet over blue Mediterranean waters. Religious banners fluttered from every mast, Golden crosses gleamed in sunlight. Drum sounds and commands echoed across waves. Aboard these vessels traveled more than 80,000 men, including some of Europe's fiercest soldiers. Among them was Miguel de Cervantes, the future author of Don Quixote, and a young common soldier serving in a Spanish company. Though sick with fever on battle day, he refused to remain below deck, insisting on fighting despite his weakened condition. The fleet sailed east across the Adriatic, searching for the Ottoman fleet. Anxiety grew with each passing day. Contradictory rumors arrived constantly. Then, on the morning of October 7th, as the Christian fleet sailed close to Greece's western coast, observers atop the mast shouted the warning everyone had both expected and feared: sails on the horizon. Many sails. Don Juan immediately summoned his top commanders for a final war conference. The Christian fleet would be organized into 3 main divisions, extending in a line about 3 miles wide. Don Juan would personally command the center division aboard the Royal Galley, a magnificent vessel adorned with gold and crimson silk. To his right, commanding the southern wing, would be Giovanni Andrea Doria. To his left, commanding the northern wing, would be Agostino Barbarigo, a Venetian admiral determined to avenge Cyprus's loss. And then there were the Galleasses. Don Juan made the crucial decision to position these 6 vessels at the head of the Christian battle line, 2 opposite each division. They were to serve as a first line of defense, absorbing and disrupting the initial Ottoman attack. It was a risky strategy. If the Galleasses failed to slow the enemy advance, they would simply become obstacles for the Christian fleet itself. On the Ottoman side, Ali Pasha also organized his fleet into 3 divisions. He held considerable numerical advantage, with some 300 galleys against approximately 208 Christian vessels. His strategy was classic and time-tested: advance quickly, use numerical superiority to envelop the Christian fleet's wings, then converge on the center in a devastating pincer movement. By noon, both fleets were ready. The moment was charged with historical significance, transcending the battle itself. It was a clash of civilizations, religions, and fundamentally different worldviews. Both sides believed they fought not merely for territory or political power, but for their way of life's very survival. Don Juan, in a gesture that would become legendary, ordered a large crucifix erected on his galley's mast. He then traveled the fleet in a small boat, visiting each division, speaking to commanders and common soldiers, inspiring them with encouragement and reminding them of the stakes. Around 12:30, the order was given. The Ottoman galleys began to advance, their oars striking water in perfect synchrony. It was a sight simultaneously beautiful and terrifying. Hundreds of vessels moving as a single organism, their sharp prows cutting through waves, their green banners fluttering in the wind. The Christian fleet remained in formation, waiting. This was the most difficult part of any battle, the moment of uncertainty before contact. Many prayed, some aloud, others silently. Priests moved among the men, offering final absolution. Then, when the Ottoman galleys in the vanguard reached about 1,000 meters, the Galleasses opened fire. The effect was devastating and completely unexpected for the Ottomans. The heavy cannons on the Galleasses' bows fired almost simultaneously, creating a wall of fire and smoke. 20-kilogram iron shells flew through the air at terrifying speeds, striking the Ottoman galleys leading the attack. What followed was carnage. Those cannonballs striking galleys packed with men not only pierced holes, but continued their trajectory through entire ranks of soldiers and oarsmen, turning flesh and bone into red mist. Within minutes, several Ottoman galleys in the vanguard were transformed into floating wreckage. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical. The Ottomans had expected a traditional-style battle. No one had prepared for this kind of concentrated artillery fire. The Ottoman formation, which should have been a powerful lance piercing the Christian center, began to fragment even before actual fighting began. But the Ottomans were seasoned warriors. They regrouped and continued their advance, their galleys accelerating as fast as possible, trying to pass the Galleasses before they could reload and fire again. Many succeeded. The Galleasses, for all their firepower, were slow to reload, and had limited fields of fire. Dozens of Ottoman galleys passed them by and crashed into the main Christian line. The clash was titanic. Wood collided with wood with a crash that could be heard for miles. Rams pierced holes, grappling hooks pinned vessels together. Thousands of men threw themselves into mortal combat. In the center of the line, Don Juan's galley collided directly with Ali Pasha's galley. It was as if fate itself had arranged this duel between the two supreme commanders. Ottoman Janissaries, the finest soldiers in their empire, faced the Spanish tercios, Europe's most feared infantry. For 3 hours, the battle lurched back and forth. The Ottomans, with their characteristic ferocity, briefly captured the royal galley's forecastle. For terrifying moments, it seemed Don Juan would be captured or killed. But reinforcements arrived from neighboring galleys. The Christians regained lost ground. On the wings, equally fierce battles raged. Boberigo led his Venetians with particular fury, remembering Cyprus. He was wounded early by an arrow that pierced his eye, but refused to leave the deck, continuing to command while bleeding profusely. On the southern wing, Ulu Kali, the Italian renegade, demonstrated why he was considered one of the Mediterranean's most cunning commanders. His galleys penetrated the Christian line, causing chaos. But Don Juan had maintained a reserve that he sent to stabilize the situation in the center. The battle finally reached its climax. Ali Pasha, fighting personally on his galley's bow, was struck by an arquebus shot. He fell mortally wounded. Christian soldiers immediately rushed him, and within moments his head was severed and raised on a spear. A scream of horror ran through the Ottoman fleet when they saw their dead commander. Conversely, the Christians let out a roar of triumph. This marked the decisive turning point. By late afternoon, the Battle of Lepanto was essentially over. Of the nearly 300 galleys Ali Pasha had commanded that morning, more than 200 had been destroyed or captured. Some 30,000 Ottomans were dead, and another 8,000 captured. Most significantly, 15,000 Christians who had been slaves on Ottoman galleys were freed. Christian losses, though significant, were much smaller. Some 8,000 dead and perhaps twice that number wounded. 13 galleys had been lost. It was a crushing victory by any measure. The invincibility of the Ottoman fleet had been decisively shattered in a single afternoon of fighting. The story of Lepanto carries profound lessons that resonate through centuries. First is the power of technological innovation. The Ottomans had numerical superiority, a winning tradition, and confidence born of decades of victories. But faced with new technology they hadn't anticipated and for which they were unprepared, their advantage evaporated. Second concerns the importance of unity in the face of existential threat. The Holy League was an unlikely alliance of states that were normally rivals, or even enemies. But in the face of the Ottoman threat, these differences were temporarily set aside. Third is about leadership. Don Juan of Austria was only 24 when he commanded the Holy League fleet. He was young, relatively inexperienced in naval warfare, and commanded admirals much older and more experienced than himself. But he possessed charisma, courage, and the ability to inspire men to give their best. The Galleasses at Lepanto represented the future of naval warfare, but a future that would take decades to fully realize. They foreshadowed the ships of the line of the 18th century, frigates and warships powered entirely by sail and armed with banks of cannons. The true revolution in naval warfare would come with the development of line-of-battle tactics, where heavily armed sailing ships would sail in parallel formations, exchanging artillery salvos until one side was destroyed. This was the naval warfare that Nelson would master at Trafalgar more than 2 centuries later. But the seeds of this revolution were sown at Lepanto. In the weeks after the battle, as the Holy League fleet regrouped and repaired its damage, the full magnitude of the victory began to sink in. Church bells rang in every Christian city. Processions of thanksgiving filled the streets. Pope Pius V fell to his knees in prayer upon receiving the news. Don Juan of Austria instantly became Europe's most celebrated hero. At 24, he had commanded the greatest naval victory of the century. Poets composed verses in his praise. Artists painted his portrait. He seemed destined for even greater things. But history took a different course. The Holy League began to disintegrate almost immediately after the battle. Old rivalries resurfaced. Venice negotiated a separate peace with the Ottomans. Spain redirected resources elsewhere. Don Juan never had the opportunity to capitalize on his victory. Dying in 1578 at age 33 of typhoid fever, the Ottomans demonstrated remarkable resilience. In less than a year, Istanbul's arsenals had built a new fleet of over 200 galleys. Yet something fundamental had changed. The Ottoman aura of invincibility had been shattered. It had been proven they could be defeated. Lepanto marked the end of Ottoman expansion in the Western Mediterranean. Although they remained a powerful force for centuries, they never again seriously attempted to invade Italy or threaten the heartland of Western Christendom. More than 450 years after Lepanto, we live in a world shaped in part by that distant confrontation. The balance between Europe and the Ottoman Empire that emerged after Lepanto influenced centuries of subsequent history. The European confidence restored by victory contributed to the age of exploration and subsequent European world domination. The very galleys and galleasses that fought at Lepanto have long since decayed into dust. The men who crewed them are centuries dead. The empires they fought for have transformed beyond recognition or disappeared altogether. But Lepanto's fundamental lesson remains relevant. Traditional advantages can be overcome by innovation. The secret weapon that destroyed the Ottoman navy at Lepanto wasn't just a machine or a tactic. It was the willingness to think differently, to challenge convention, to risk innovation against tradition. It was the recognition that the world was changing and that those who failed to change with it would be left behind. For those who fought that day, there was an additional dimension to their victory. When Don Juan raised the crucifix to his galley's mast before battle, he acknowledged something his men deeply understood. They fought not only with strategy and weapons, but with faith. The Christian commanders believed that divine providence had guided their hands, strengthened their hearts, and blessed their weapons. This faith, this absolute conviction that they were fighting for something greater than themselves, gave them a strength that transcended the merely material. Whatever our modern perspective on those distant events, we cannot fully understand Lepanto without acknowledging this spiritual dimension. For the men who fought and died that day, Lepanto was more than a naval battle. It was a moment when they believed the divine had intervened in human history. This is the immortal lesson of Lepanto, to preserve forever in humanity's memory that courage, innovation, and faith can together overcome even the most impossible obstacles. On that October day in 1571, in the Gulf of Patras, more than just one battle was decided. The future of naval warfare was transformed. The balance between Europe and Asia shifted, and a lesson was taught that would resonate through the centuries: innovation. Leadership and unity can overcome even the most daunting obstacles. When we look back through history's telescope to that distant day, we see not just a battle, but a moment of transformation. We see the end of one era and the beginning of another. We see courage and sacrifice, genius and error, triumph and tragedy. And at the center of it all, we see those 6 Venetian Galleasses. Monstrous and revolutionary, their rows of cannons spewing fire and death, breaking formations that had remained unchanged for centuries, proving that the future always belongs to those brave enough to embrace change. This is the story of the Battle of Lepanto and the secret weapon that destroyed the Ottoman navy. A story of innovation over tradition, of courage over numbers, of vision over complacency. It reminds us that no advantage is permanent, no empire eternal, and that the only constant in history is change. And it teaches us that those who shape the future are those willing to risk the present in the name of a new vision.